Erev Tov Naharia, Boker Tov, Boker Raton, and a meaningful Memorial Day weekend to all of our friends commemorating, remembering service people over this holiday weekend. Today, our Friends Indeed series takes us on an amazing live virtual tour by our friend and renowned tour guide, Reuven Solomon, who has guided numerous AIFL delegations over 2 decades in Israel. We also have some of our AIFL delegation alumni from around the country who are also on the Zoom screen today as part of our virtual tour group, and they'll hopefully have a chance to ask some questions live with Reuven. We have Susie Cooper, a YASI Youth Ambassador student, exchange student, who's now in Detroit, who's with us. Dr. Don Weinroth, who was with us with a superintendent's mission from Oklahoma City. Rosa Solorio from our influential women's delegation, who's now in Virginia. And Jeanette Manning, who's also an influential woman, but she was with us on a different delegation with the National Association of Attorney Generals based here in Washington, D.C., but calling in from Maryland, where I am today as well. For everyone on this call, whether on Zoom or on Facebook, we want to ask you to use your chat function. And first of all, just start off by telling us about your favorite spot in Jerusalem. Where was it when you actually visited last? Was it a Mamuna celebration in Gan Sachar? Was it drinking tea, nana, with that minty spice that you can only get in the Middle East on the Midrachov in some small cafe? Were you visiting and walking around the four quarters in Jerusalem on foot and wondering how your feet are going to hold up at the end of the day? Whatever that is, you can kick back, you can relax. We've got a great program for you today. We do want you to feel free to send in your questions, throughout, and we'll try to get a question in if we can, time permitting. But even if we can't, we promise that Reuven will answer the questions afterwards if there's something burning that you weren't able to get in during your delegation. So I already see people writing in Temple Mount was a favorite of someone in on the Zoom chat. For everybody on Facebook, let's share the love, right? All you have to do is hit watch party. It took me only a couple of times and a couple of teenagers in the house to explain it to me. So if you have one of those things and some patience, go ahead and just hit watch party. Share, you're sharing it, and then other people who have nothing to do on Memorial Day Sunday today can join in as well. I want to begin now by sharing a couple of messages, because as you know, it's Yom Yerushalayim this week in Jerusalem, and we have a special greeting from the mayor of Jerusalem to kick off our program, Mayor Moshe Leon.
Jerusalem, the city which lies in the heart of millions of people around the world. For the Jewish people, this is the very center of the universe. Every stone in this city tells a story. And the story of this city, the story of Jerusalem, is one of faith. It is one of hope. And it is a story of renewal. From the destruction of the first temple, Jerusalem has been built and rebuilt many times. And 53 years ago, we reunited the city and began to rebuild it, this time forever. 53 years ago, Jerusalem became whole. And since then, we have come a long way. Just behind me, here was a border until 1967. Before Israel freed the city, the old city lay in ruins, holy places, and were left to decay, or worse, destroyed. However, today we are proud that Jerusalem is thriving as a place of faith and culture, and as a place of innovation and trade. We have seen in the last weeks how Jerusalem's hospitals and medical centers face the challenge of the coronavirus, saving lives and keeping us safe. Yes, the cost of the lockdown has been very high, but just as we always have, we will rebuild. We will rise up and we continue to hold the torch of the hope high as we see to the world. Jerusalem is of course the light for the whole world. These have been dark times for Jewish communities around the world, and I hope that on this Jerusalem Day we can all stand together and share in the light. I hope that we mark another year of free, united Jerusalem. We can all say Leshana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim. I hope we can welcome you all to Jerusalem very soon. Happy Jerusalem Day.
And from the offices of the municipality of Jerusalem to the streets of Jerusalem, I now want to introduce our special friend and a repeat AIFL webinar participant, Jerusalem Deputy Mayor Fleur Hassan Nahum.
Hello everyone, and happy Jerusalem Day to all of you in the America-Israel Friendship League. I'm so proud to be able to speak to you today. I understand that you're going to have incredible virtual tours of the old city for all religions. Jerusalem really is the center of the world, and it's not just the capital city for the people who live here, but it's also the capital city for all our Jewish family and friends around the world. And so today, through the virtual tours, I hope you reconnect to Jerusalem and to its wonders and to the layers and layers of history until you can come back and visit us in person. Enjoy.
Okay. Now for the real fun. Reuven, I know it's been a sweltering week of heat in Israel, but Jerusalem's always just a little bit cooler. It seems to me every time that I'm there, I have to put on a jacket or a sweater, regardless of what time of year. It's an escape. It's an escape for the senses of smell and taste and sound. It's timeless. So where are you going to start us on this timeless tour to Jerusalem?
Well, Wayne, actually, I'm sitting here at home in Kfar Vradim, which has similar weather to Jerusalem. And believe it or not, it rained heavily last night and rained this morning. And the temperature has dropped from last week by about 10 degrees Celsius in a day. So that's why I have a long sleeve shirt on. And I want to say shalom to all of you. It's so lovely to see so many friendly faces. Greetings, and I'm so glad and so happy to be with you once again. Today, it's a very appropriate day to actually tour Jerusalem, because as the present-day mayor of Jerusalem mentioned, 53 years have passed since the city of Jerusalem has been united. We celebrated that on Friday, and it's also a special occasion for our Muslim friends, because tonight on Sunday night, at sundown, the Eid al-Fitr will come to a conclusion. The holiday that marks the end of Ramadan. So we say to our Muslim friends, Eid Mubarak. And as I said, ideal time to visit Jerusalem, but you know, visiting Jerusalem is not a 45 or 1 hour visit. It's days and weeks and months. So in this very limited time that we have, we're going to concentrate on a small portion of Jerusalem, a small part of Jerusalem, and deal mainly with its connection with the three major monotheistic religions, the great religions of the world, and their connection with Jerusalem. So welcome to the virtual tour, and I hope that you all enjoy it. You see the slide with the golden dome, almost in the center, the Dome of the Rock, and that's where we're going to begin our visit to Jerusalem, because that's the first Jewish connection to Jerusalem. Under that golden dome is what we believe was Mount Moriah, where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, our first patriarch, nearly sacrificing Isaac on a hill called Mount Moriah, surrounded by hills, as we say, Yerushalayim Harim Savivla, Jerusalem surrounded by hills. Well, Mount Moriah was not the highest, but a central hill in Jerusalem, and herein begins the Jewish connection. In the time of King David, when many areas are conquered by the 12 tribes of Israel, one slither of a city, a fortified city, controlled by the Jebusites, remains unconquered. So when King David wants to build a capital city and unite the 12 tribes around, uniting them to one capital city, he needs to choose a place that is neutral, like a Washington, D.C. It can't be in any tribal land. It has to be a neutral area. And King David decides to conquer the Jebusite city, and he does so, and he wants to build the house of the Lord to the north of the city, outside the present day when he conquers it, city walls. He doesn't get to do that. It's his son Solomon who gets to build the first temple on Mount Moriah, the very site where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, after King David incidentally purchases that site from Araunah the Jebusite, who wants to gift it to David, but King David says, this is a gift I'm giving to God, and you don't repackage a present you got. It has to be titled and deeded, and he purchases the land for 50 silver shekels, but it is Solomon who builds the beautiful first temple to the north of the city, outside the city walls. Now, in the time of Solomon, Jerusalem is extended and expanded, but when Solomon dies, the kingdom splits. 10 leaders of 10 of the tribes, I have to remind you, the tribal system had already broken down, but 10 leaders of 10 of the tribes take with them whoever from their tribes want to come with them to the northern kingdom and establish a rival kingdom to the kingdom of Judah. Now, in 721 BC, the northern kingdom is demolished by the Assyrian conquest. The Assyrians then turn their eyes to Jerusalem, but these are the days of Isaiah and Hezekiah strengthens the walls of Jerusalem, building the broad wall. He brings the water that was flowing outside the city of David into the city. And the Assyrians, as Isaiah had prophesied, do not fire and do not shoot an arrow within the walls of Jerusalem. However, shortly after that, 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, attacks Jerusalem in the days of Zedekiah and razes it to the ground, to Solomon's temple and Jerusalem razed to the ground. The Assyrians, when they conquered their people, scattered them, and this gives rise to the 10 lost tribes of Israel, the legend of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the Babylonians behaved very differently. They took their people and exported them en masse to disorient them, but to have them organized enough not to be a burden. And so the Jews are exiled by the waters of Babylon. It is by the waters of Babylon that they are asked to sing their beautiful songs of the temple when they respond, How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I remember thee not above my chiefest joy, Jerusalem. This is when Zionism is born. It's not a new phenomenon. 2,500 years ago, the Jews, by the waters of Babylon, longed for a return to Jerusalem. That is not long in coming when the Persians overthrow the Babylonians, and Cyrus, who we call the good king, allows conquered people to go back to their lands, their homeland, and rebuild. These are the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and in 519 BCE, Jerusalem is rebuilt, and a very poor reproduction of Solomon's temple is built on the very site where the first temple stood. The period of the Persians soon gives way to Alexander the Great, who in 332 BCE conquers Jerusalem, and this becomes what is known as the beginning of the Hellenization of the area. As soon as Alexander dies, his kingdom is rivaled for by his different generals, and we fall in between two of them. Pompey to the south and Seleucid to the north, and we are in between them. A particularly nasty Seleucid ruler in 141 BCE, and you know this well, the story, because we Jews celebrate it every year at Hanukkah, the rededication of the temple, is when Antiochus Epiphanes IV destroys, first of all, desecrates the temple, plundering it. And this gives rise to a revolt led by Mattathias or Matityahu from a priestly family who revolts against the Greek regime, and miraculously this family-led revolt ends up in overthrowing the Greek regime, leading the country into nearly 100 years of Hasmonean Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is rebuilt. It is expanded, and during the Hasmonean period, and unfortunately, the Hasmoneans bring about their self-destruction when brother fights brother about who will take over rule. And Pompey, the Roman, is invited in 63 BC to settle the dispute. The Romans come in and remain. This period of Roman Second Temple period, because the Second Temple still stands, is punctuated by troubles, and it is in 40 BC when a Jew, Herod the Great, is appointed by Rome to be the Jewish king of the Roman province of Judea. Herod the Great's most masterful work was the rebuilding that you saw in the previous couple of slides that we will go back to, the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the refurbishing of the very beautiful temple that he replaces the temple of Ezra and Nehemiah with. And now you see this, the slide that marks a wonderful model, scale model, 50:1 scale model that today stands in the Israel Museum of Jerusalem on the eve of her destruction. The centerpiece, of course, this 50:1 ratio is the Temple Mount. It's the Temple Mount itself and the glorious temple in the center of the picture that you see that Herod rebuilds. Now, just before Herod dies, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, about a 20-minute ride from Jerusalem, and we're going to come back to the Christian side of the story. But after Herod dies, things deteriorate badly. By 66, 65 CE or AD, the trouble explodes and the Jews go to war against the Romans, the Jewish war. If you want to read a most horrific description of warfare that you could imagine, read the chapter in the Jewish war of Yosef ben Matityahu, or Josephus, of the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is totally destroyed by Titus and the 10th Legion of the Roman army, and once again the Jews are exiles in their own land. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem ends up in a scattering again of the peoples, but less than 60 years later, 70 years later, another revolt takes place, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is very, very strongly put down by the Emperor Hadrian, who imposes a new name on the Roman province of Judea, too Jewish sounding. He calls it Palestina Secunda, the Roman province of Palestina, which takes the name from the disposed Philistines who vied for the land. Now, he also gives a new name to Jerusalem, Aelia Capitolina, his capital. And the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem and once again strangers in their own land. The years of exile, 2,000 years of exile, have a whole list of conquests and reconquests, with the Muslim conquest and then the Crusaders in 1099, and then Saladin with the Muslims again ousting the first Crusader kingdom, and then the Crusaders come back and they're ousted by Baibars the Mameluke in the end of the 1200s, and then once again Jerusalem is in the hands of Muslims, and they're succeeded by the Ottomans, who in 1517 become the rulers of the area right up until 1917.
Quick question. The questions and comments are just flying in. Already a question about archaeological evidence for the first temple.
Wonderful, wonderful question. The Babylonians did a very thorough job of destroying everything that Solomon had built, but what they didn't destroy was what was under the later monumental city of David, where the evidence of King David and King Solomon come to life, with names from the Bible popping up out of the ground from that very period. We can connect with findings in the city of David directly. The ministers of King Zedekiah, who were sent to Jeremiah to tell him to stop bad-mouthing the king. And their names are on seals that we found in the city of David. So yes, the archaeological evidence is very solid. In fact, Elat Mazar, and most of us totally agree with her, thinks she has found the palace of King David. The archaeological evidence certainly supports her thoughts. So yes, there is archaeological evidence, but not of the temple that was thoroughly razed by the Babylonians. So to continue, we have the Ottoman period coming to an end with the Allies' victory in the First World War, and a trickle of Jews coming mainly at first from Eastern Europe to create the new Jew, to settle a land, the ancient land, where Jews, after 2,000 years of wandering, will be at home again. Now, in the British Mandate, this involved a struggle. It didn't come easy, but after the, I would say, the lowest point of Jewish existence during the Second World War and the Holocaust, the United Nations decides that part of the land will be of Palestine, that name that Hadrian gave it, will be the Jewish state. And after the British Mandate is over, on the 14th of May, 1948, Ben-Gurion declares the independence of Israel in a slither of land. You're hearing the actual recorded voice of David Ben-Gurion at this momentous event in a nondescript hall of an art museum that was the home of the first mayor of Tel Aviv, a most unlikely place for a grand declaration of independence, but boy, was it grand.
ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל, ותוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה.
I would like to read you
ארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל.
I still get goosebumps when I hear that. I would like to read you a thought of a representative that was at this independence meeting. Her name was Rachel Kagan. She was the WITSO representative, and this is what she writes. I won't forget the tikva when we sang it. It sounded different, the sound of a hope that came true, a trumpet blast of joy dilated with sadness. This sadness came from the knowledge that some of us had that the Arab armies were already approaching our borders. We knew that our boys would soon be leaving or had already left for the front. How would we stand up to the challenge? We had faith, but there was also fear. And by this, our happiness was tempered by sadness. I also remember leaving the museum. Evening was falling. The sky was blue, but in the west it was reddening from the setting sun. There was a kind of symbolism in this, the blue of hope, peace, and serenity, and the red of fire and blood. The War of Independence was very costly. 1% of the entire Jewish population of the land, 6,000 people of 600,000, gave their lives in that war. It ended up with the Jews holding onto more land than the partition plan of the United Nations allowed for, but Jerusalem remained a divided city. And for 20 years, Jerusalem was a divided city until, and once again, you know, Ben-Gurion said it best of all, and he's been paraphrased many times, that in this land, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. And in the Six-Day War, Jerusalem was reunited as an undivided city. And here you see, once again, Jews by the wall. You're going to hear a song that has to be one of my favorite songs, Jerusalem of Gold. And I want to tell you a little bit about this song. You know, it was the mayor, Teddy Koch, who was mayor at the time that Jerusalem was reunited, who asked songwriters to write a song about Jerusalem before the Six-Day War. And they turned him down because Jerusalem's not the hottest of topics. One songwriter, Naomi Shemer, writes this song. It's a song of longing, of Jerusalem, of regretting how sad it is that we can't go down to the Dead Sea by way of Jericho, of how sad that the water systems are dry, and that the marketplaces are empty, and there are no Jews by the Temple Mount and by the Western Wall. A song of longing. Incredibly, this song gains tremendous success. And young Shuli Natan, who you can hear in the background, had to repeat singing that song. And I'm saying before the 6-day war. A few days later, Naomi Shemer had to add another verse. The verse that says, now we do go down to the Dead Sea by way of Jericho. The water systems are refilling. The marketplaces are busy. And there are Jews by the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. For 2,000 years after a separation from the most important site to Judaism, the Jews are back in charge of their own destiny on a slither of land. That's the Jewish connection. Next slide you're going to see is very iconic. Those 3 paratroopers by the Western Wall, then and now. After 2,000 years, Jerusalem reunited, and as the present-day mayor just said, to never be divided again. From here, we're going to move on to Christianity and its link with Jerusalem. Now,
Reuven?
Yes, sir.
I was just going to add, I just hate interrupting. You've got so much to talk about. But just the question earlier about the first temple evidence, I just thought I would add that one of our delegations, well, all of them now, participated in the sifting project up in the North Kidron Valley. And one of our students found the part of an idol from First Temple period during one of those sifting experiences. And so there's evidence that is continuing to turn up.
Absolutely. And you know what Hezekiah said about those idols? Destroy your idols. So some of the Jews were playing it safe, backing it each way, as they say. Yeah. So if you have a no smoking sign, someone's smoking. And if you have destroy your idol sign, someone's keeping idols under their bed. And as you say, some parts of them have been found. So folks, we're now going to move to the Christian connection. Now, I have to tell you that you need much more than a 14-day intensive pilgrimage to see even a small part of the Christian sites in the Holy Land. And hopefully in a future virtual visit, I hope maybe not, because this Corona business will be over by quickly enough, I hope. But if not, we will also have a tour perhaps of the Christian sites around the north and the Sea of Galilee. But for today, I have to limit myself to the last hours of Jesus' life on earth as man in order to abide by the time constraints. So we're going to concentrate on the last few hours, the last day of Jesus' time on earth, to tell the story of the deep connection between Christianity and Jerusalem. You may remember that Jesus called the Temple Mount, the Holy of Holies, the house of his Father. But here, we're going to pick up where Jesus spends his last night on earth as man, in a garden where olives are grown, beaten off the trees, crushed and squeezed for the olive oil, very, very symbolic of where the last night is spent. And in this garden that didn't have this beautiful church standing on it then, of course, but it had olive presses, is where Jesus asks the disciples to stay awake with him and watch. They fall asleep, and he says to them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That beautiful church that you saw in the previous slide, and perhaps we can go back to it to give you another view of it, is a church of all nations built by that brilliant architect, Antonio Bellucci, who rebuilt in the 1920s many Byzantine churches. And the way he was able to do this is that he had the plans. The floor plan was always there in the archaeology, but you need more than a floor plan to build a church. And fortunately for us, the Byzantines left many pictures of their churches in mosaics in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Israel, and many other parts of the world as well. And when Antonio Bellucci was able to find a mosaic picture that fit the floor plan, he knew he had the church. And this All Nations Church is built on the very site where the earlier Byzantine church was built in the 4th, 5th century. Inside this beautiful church with its spectacular facade is bedrock that is called the Rock of Agony. That is the rock where Jesus falls and asks for the cup to be raised from him, but not his will, but his Father's will. Here, in the early hours of the morning, he is betrayed, captured and taken to the house of Caiaphas, where he held overnight, and in the morning, produced before Pontius Pilatus. The last hours, if we can go to the next slide, you will see, and the next one, this is incidentally a 2,000-year-old olive tree. Then this slide shows us the 14 stations they're marked on, superimposed on a Byzantine model, if you like, of Jerusalem of its day. In other words, 5th century, where the route of sorrow, the way that Jesus was led to crucifixion and resurrection, is marked in the stations from 1 to 14, with the last 4 stations inside the building that Helena, Constantine's mother, built over what she believed were the final stations of the cross. We shall be following this route, but I want to make clear that there were several other ideas of where the route would have gone. This is mainly a route that is followed by the Eastern Orthodox and by the Catholic branch, but there's very much agreement of the route, actually, because of the condemnation in the Antonia fortress to the number 7 station, where Jesus is led outside of the city walls towards the site of crucifixion. Now, as I said, this is a Byzantine model that this route has been superimposed on, and I'm not going to be taking any sides, but in the next slide we'll talk about the 2 possible sites of crucifixion and, more importantly, resurrection, all in near proximity to each other. What you're seeing here is the courtyard of the present-day Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can make out the very Crusader additions here. And Helena had built this site in 335 CE because she was told that here was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, where Jesus was laid in, and from here he was resurrected. And she builds a massive church around the site. Gordon of Khartoum, General Gordon, in the late 1800s, comes to visit the church, and he is very bitterly disappointed. He said, "This can't be the site. It's within city walls." He didn't realize, of course, that in the time of Jesus, it would not have been within city walls. And more so, it's a church and not a garden. And disappointed, he walks around the outside of the walls of the city. And we're going to take that walk that takes him outside the Damascus Gate. In the next slide, you will see that he looks across from the Damascus Gate and he sees what appears to be a garden tomb, with a tomb and a rolling stone. But what brings it to his attention is what you're going to see in the next slide. A skull-shaped rock in the side of the cliff. Golgotha, Gulgolet, skull in Hebrew Aramaic, that incredibly existed in that chapel that was covered in the courtyard of the Holy Sepulchre, and existed too here. And in both sites, amazingly, a tomb was found that could be called tomb of a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea. Amazingly, both sites were in most likelihood used by the Romans for public execution because they were on main routes and they were outside the city walls. So I'm not going to take any sides. Protestants like to visit both sites usually. They prefer the Garden Tomb for its atmosphere of non-church. Catholics will visit the Holy Sepulcher. Protestants will visit the Garden Tomb and sometimes also the Holy Sepulcher. As I said, I'm not taking sides, but I'm going to take you now along the route of what is called the Station of the Cross. And here we are, after the production of Jesus to Pontius Pilate at the foundations today of the Antonia Fortress. Jesus is condemned. This is not the way it looked. The foundations are way below. But this archway, you see, dates to the time of Hadrian. He built it after 100 years after the crucifixion. He built it because he wanted to obliterate the memory of early Christians who worshipped at that site as the first station where Jesus was condemned. And he wanted to obliterate it by building something very Roman. What you're seeing is the large arch, two smaller arches. One can be actually seen in the church of the Lithostratus, the stone floor. And he builds it, ironically, to obliterate, but it certainly does the opposite. Because to this day, this arch marks for us the Ecce Homo arch, where Pontius Pilatus says, here is the man when he presents Jesus to the Roman soldiers to be taken to execution, crucifixion. So what he wanted to obliterate, he reinstates. Station 1, the station of condemnation. Across the pavement is, who else? Antonio Baluzzi, a rebuilt Byzantine church built very close to the Lithostratus, where Jesus is beaten, given a wooden cross to bear, and a crown of thorns to wear. Second station, the station of flagellation. The procession then begins and heads towards the outlet of the city. And here we will go to the next slide and see station 3, where Jesus falls under the burden of the cross for the first time. Right beside station 3, which today is occupied by the Armenian Catholic Patriarch, right beside it is probably the most painful station for Jesus. In the next slide, you shall see station 4, where he meets his mother, Mary, on the road. Continuing towards the outlet of the city, he is passed by station 5, a very important station for Black Christians, because here, most of these stations, incidentally, are actually mentioned in the Gospel, including this one. Simon, or Shimon, from Cyrenia, helps carry the cross of Jesus. Now, Shimon is a Jewish name. Cyrenia is in Africa. And in the days where only a Judeo could be a Judeo-Christian, Shimon is probably the very first Black Christian. And hence, Station 5, a very important site for Black Christians. This route leads up towards the outlet of the city, where we pass by Station 6, which is purely a traditional station not mentioned in the Gospels. The station where Veronica, a young maiden, wipes the brow of Jesus and an image of his face remains on the handkerchief, not to be confused with the Shroud of Turin, and purely traditional station. And in fact, its very name tells us how it's very much a traditional station. Veronica, Vera icon. From here, not mentioned, as I said, in the Gospels. From here, we get to the outlet of the city from the time of Jesus. The 7th station on 1st Street. Don't be confused, that's not 8. That's the 7th station on 1st Street, where Jesus falls under the burden of the cross for the second time as he's being led outside of the city. Now, if you will, I'm sorry, it's telling me that time is moving on and I have to hurry up. If you were going to the Garden Tomb, you'd turn right and you'd get towards the Damascus Gate and get to the Garden Tomb. But if you're following the ancient Via Dolorosa, the old route, you come to Station 8. And unless you can walk through the wall, you cannot take the direct route, because Helena, Constantine's mum, builds an enormous structure around the last stations of the cross, and the only way to continue to the stations is to circumvent the walls to Station 9. However, at Station 8, Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem, and they are weeping, and he says, "Weep not for me, weep for Jerusalem." Station 9 is where Jesus falls under the burden of the cross for the third time. To the right of this station is bedrock. At the St. Hellenic Coptic Church, you will find bedrock and a cistern dug into the bedrock. To the left of it is an enormous pit upon which an enormous structure, the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, has been built. But in the time of Jesus, it was an abandoned stone quarry that grave diggers would come in after the quarry is abandoned and make it stone, and make it a garden tomb. And from Station 9, the third falling of Jesus, we come down to Station 10, which is today covered by the chapel you see in front of you. It is the chapel where Jesus is stripped of his clothing by the Roman soldiers. The rest of the stations, that's Station 10 that you see there, the rest of the stations are all within this church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see the very Crusader additions to the entrance to this church. And as I said, you're going to need a tremendous amount of imagination to see it the way it would have been in the time of Jesus, because as I said, abandoned stone quarries became garden tombs. And inside this church are the final stations. Station 11, the Franciscan Catholic station, where Jesus is nailed close to the very top of this skull-shaped rock to a wooden cross. Franciscan altar. Station 12, right beside it, is the Greek Orthodox altar, where the crosses are put upright, the central one, Jesus, and the two sides, the two thieves. You see the marble and the glass covering this altar. That's because pilgrims would dig away with their fingernails to take a souvenir away, and the way to protect it was to cover it with marble and glass. Station 12, where Jesus is put up on the wooden cross. You know, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had some influence and probably a lot of money to bribe Pontius Pilatus with, and they arranged to have Jesus brought down from the cross a lot earlier than the Romans would normally allow, and because it was approaching the Jewish Sabbath, and they wanted the burial to take place before the Sabbath. We Jews get into trouble with coroners all over the world, because we want to bury straight after death. Here with Pontius Pilatus's agreement, Jesus is brought down from the cross before the Jewish Sabbath to be properly anointed, wrapped in a shroud, and placed in the unused family tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the Station 14 that lay in front of you. Now, the first thing...
Reuven, there's a question that came in from Facebook from Janita asking about why there was a building placed around the final stations and not left alone.
Very good question. Helena, Saint Helena, Constantine's mother, thought it was very, very important to mark these sites for all times by building altars and churches where anything of any specially relevance took place, and thus all sites that were pointed out to her as holy sites, she built something around and over, and the Holy Sepulchre was no exception.
Any other questions from my panel of delegation alumni up on the screen? We're coming into our final headway here. I know Don jumped in early. Anyone else with any questions before we move? No? Okay.
Okay, so I want to go back to that slide, please, the tomb. I want to explain why what should be a cave in the side of a cliff is a freestanding building. Helena again, when she is pointed out that cave where in the side of a cliff where Jesus was laid in, she instructs that the rest of the caves be cut away and moved so that that cave will be above ground, a freestanding monument, and it's only later in the 1700s that this edifice is built around it. Unfortunately, the actual tomb was badly destroyed by the Persians in 613, and then totally destroyed by El-Hakim, the crazed convert to Islam, in 1000, the Egyptian ruler. So very little part, only the back part of the tomb remains intact. But listen, why is this place so holy to Christianity? Not because of the crucifixion and the laying of the holy tomb, of course, but because of what happened when the three Marys come to visit on the Sunday morning. You may remember the gardener says to them, "Why do you come? To see, you don't see the living in the place of the dead." And the resurrection site is marked as this tomb. And Helena, incidentally, calls it not the Church of the Holy Tomb, but the Church of Resurrection. And only later is the dome enclosed. And thus, the resurrection, one of the three most important mysteries of early Christianity, marks this site as very holy to Christians. As I said, on a subsequent visit to Jerusalem, we may be able to visit many other sites where Christianity and the miracles of Jesus take place. But now we're going to move to our final portion, and that is Islam and Jerusalem. And as I said, it's an appropriate time because the journey of Muhammad, according to the Quran, to a faraway place where he receives the Quran itself. Although Jerusalem is not mentioned as this faraway place, the spoken Islamic tradition, the Hadith, marks Jerusalem as the site where Muhammad in 610 comes to receive the Quran at a distant mosque. He prays at this distant mosque and he meets Abraham, Moses, and Jesus there. And thus this site, from that time onwards, becomes the third most important site to Islam in the world after Mecca and Medina. And the mosque itself that you see with a silver dome slightly tarnished there is called the distant mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that you shall see in the next slide. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, the distant mosque, is actually the third most holy site. And I want to show you the facade of this mosque in the next slide, where you will see the Crusader additions to some of it. But it is an absolutely beautiful building inside and out. It is built on top of a hollow entrance to the Temple Mount that Herod the Great had built through the Hulda gates. So this mosque has a lot of underground space in what is wrongly called Solomon's stables, which are really the grand entrance through the Hulda gates that Herod the Great had built in his temple. And in the next slide, you'll see another beautiful picture of the facade of the Al-Aqsa Mosque that is not to be confused with this next slide, the Golden Dome, which is not a mosque, but a monument, the Dome of the Rock. This beautiful monument has been just damaged and repaired several times, with the last addition being the actual gold leaf placed on the dome itself, real gold leaf. This is the site where the Holy of Holies stood, in the first temple, in the second temple, very close proximity, as you can see, to the western wall and on the Temple Mount itself. And it is from here that it is believed that Muhammad ascended to the 7 levels of heaven, returning with the Quran. And thus the Temple Mount, and particularly The Al-Aqsa Mosque becomes the third most important site to Islam in the world after Mecca and Medina. You know, unfortunately today, it is not possible for non-Muslims to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Dome of the Rock. This might change, I hope, in the future. But they are beautiful, beautiful buildings, and I want to take you inside the Dome of the Rock from a time where it was possible to actually enter and take pictures. What you're seeing there is the mosaic ceilings of the dome and some inscriptions of the surah, the passages from the Quran in Arabic around the sides. Following side, you will see some more of the beautiful marble work and decorations inside this building. That incidentally, I have to tell you, was a perfection of the Byzantine churches that were, those of you who've been to Israel before, remember the church on the Mount of Beatitudes, with two concentric circles, the inner one holding up the dome, Antonio Bellucci again, of course, and outside the alcoves. Well, this was a standard Byzantine structure that was beautiful, but the Muslims perfected it. They perfected it mathematically, in proportion, and this building is really one of the most spectacular buildings that one can walk through.
Reuven, I want to try to get a quick question in from Rosa before we close up on the slides. Rosa, go ahead.
Reuven, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I just have a comment and a question. One of the most striking aspects of my trip to Israel, which I'm so grateful for still, was to see the combination of religions in Jerusalem and how they're connected. And I was very honored to be able to go to most of the holy sites when I was there. And my question to you is more like, what do you think is the significance today of having all these religions in one space, and all these practices and all these idiosyncrasies? How do you think that defines Jerusalem today? And the question is more connecting the history with what's happening in Jerusalem today, which is an extraordinary city.
Well, I'm giving you my personal opinion here, of course. I think it's a message to all the world that whether you are Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, you're the same. You're worshiping the one God. You're the same. And you know what emphasizes this for me? At the rare moments when you hear the church bells, the muezzin, the Muslim call to prayer, and the Jews praying in the synagogue, or the shofar blowing. It's beautiful harmony. The sounds go together. And inshallah, one day we will learn from the sounds going together, and we will be together in one Jerusalem.
Reuven, that's indeed a beautiful vision and an appropriate one for Yom Yerushalayim. You know, our intention with trying to cover a few thousand years of history and three major religions in the course of a Zoom session was, of course, to be rather ambitious, as we've been throughout this webinar series, but with the graciousness of Reuven. And I can tell you, Reuven, you have fans from delegations passed all over the country. Lynn, who was on the trip with Jeanette as well, just wrote in saying you were actually her favorite part of memory from traveling in Jerusalem. We have other people who said it was Hezekiah's Tunnel. So when you're up against Hezekiah's Tunnel, that's pretty good competition. There were other people that said a bagel, a sesame bagel was the favorite memory from Jerusalem. So you're sandwiched somewhere in between history and the culinary senses of Jerusalem. Let me just before I'll give you the last word to send everybody off on, but I do want to acknowledge the fact that as we've been doing this series, and some of you know that our last visit with Reuven was up north in Caesarea, but each week that we've been doing this over the last several weeks, we've attempted to bring people together to take your minds off of other issues at the moment and being in isolation. And we do that as part of this broader campaign that we created at American Israel Friendship League called Friends in Deeds, where today we're announcing our 9th $500 donation of Israeli foods and treats to vulnerable communities and frontline medical staff that are battling COVID-19. And this week's recipient of our Friends and Deeds donation will be made to the Francis Tuttle Technology Center, where the lead respiratory therapy instructor, Christina Wynn, is overseeing the distribution to respiratory therapists at Intragis Canadian Valley in Yukon and Intragis Baptist Hospital in Oklahoma City. And I know we have, in addition to Don, we have other people from Oklahoma that are on the call today. So we're excited to make that donation. And you saw on the screen our web and other social handles that you can look over the last 9 weeks at some of the faces behind the masks of the people who are on the front lines today who are serving. So Reuven, any final words before we close out today?
Yes, I would ask you to keep in mind the Psalm 122, especially the 6th line. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. One small piece of real estate, so holy to the 3 great monotheistic religions of the world.
Beautiful. And again, just a program announcement, because we're going to keep going as long as we're stuck in our houses. We know that there's love to share and there are memories that can bring us joy, and that we need to do this. We need to build community. So next week, if you had a lot to eat this weekend at your barbecues and whatever else everyone's doing to keep sane, next week we got Pilates. So our colleague Naomi Reinhardt is, with a little help from some instructors in Tel Aviv and in New York, are going to get you up and moving. So come back and join us. And for those of you that are wondering when you can get your next Bissell of Reuven, we got an answer for you. This series of the virtual tours is so popular, we're just continuing it monthly. So on June 16th, we are going to visit with Reuven to, wait for it,
Masada.
We're going to Masada. So, so come back and join us. We're going to have a lot of fun with it.
The only way to visit Masada comfortably in June is virtually.
Great.
Those who have been there in June, July, and August know what I'm talking about.
Correct. Last time I was there in February, it started to rain when I was there with the Presbyterian Ministers Mission. So Masada is always full of surprises, even if you think you know the story. So come back and join us. For those of you celebrating Memorial Day this weekend or Shavuos in the coming week, we want to extend our wishes from the entire America-Israel Friendship League family for a meaningful holiday. And to all of you celebrating with us today from Yom Yerushalayim, permit me to say, L'Shana Haba, Yerushalayim, Alo Virtuali. Next year, hopefully it won't be virtual. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great week and a safe week.
Lovely to be with you.